The Washington Wizards might have one of the most confusing situations in the NBA right now. After years of losing, bad decisions, and a rebuild that seemed like it was going nowhere, suddenly Washington has Trae Young, Anthony Davis, and a potential path toward another No.1 pick. And now some Wizards fans are already talking like the rebuild is finished. They're imagining playoff series against LeBron James and the Sixers, talking about finally getting out of the first round, and acting like Washington has suddenly become a contender. But there's one huge problem that might be completely wrong. Because if you actually look at what the Wizards front office is doing, this doesn't look like a team trying to win right now. It looks like a team setting up something much bigger for the future. And once you understand the plan behind Anthony Davis and Trae Young, these moves start making a lot more sense. First, you have to understand who is running the organization. Washington brought in GM Will Dawkins and President Michael Winger, two executives with strong reputations for building organizations the right way. Dawkins spent years in Oklahoma City learning inside one of the league's most respected front offices, while Winger has worked with multiple successful organizations and has been around deep playoff teams. These aren't executives who accidentally stumbled into a rebuild. They understand asset management, player development, and, most importantly, timing. That's why one detail from Dawkins should immediately get Wizards fans' attention. After Washington landed the No.1 pick, Dawkins did not say, "The rebuild is over." Instead, the message was much more cautious. The Wizards would try to compete, but the upcoming season could essentially be an evaluation year. That tells you everything. They aren't promising a playoff run. They're evaluating what they already have. And that brings us to Anthony Davis. On the surface, acquiring a 10-time All-Star sounds like the Wizards are suddenly going all in. But think about what they actually gave up. Washington acquired Davis without surrendering a massive collection of premium assets. That means the Wizards may have gotten an elite player at exactly the kind of price rebuilding teams dream about. And if Davis performs at his best, Washington suddenly has something extremely valuable, a proven superstar who can attract contenders at the trade deadline. There's another major reason this could be the plan. Davis has reportedly had concerns about spending multiple seasons on a non-contending team, and that makes his future in Washington extremely interesting. If the Wizards don't reach an extension agreement, they could enter the season with Davis playing in a contract year. And everyone knows what a motivated Anthony Davis can look like when he's healthy and playing for something. If he dominates, stays healthy, and proves he can still be a franchise-level difference maker, his trade value could explode. Suddenly, Washington could flip a player it acquired relatively cheaply into a massive package of picks and young talent. That's classic rebuilding strategy: buy low, improve the asset, then sell high. But Anthony Davis might not even be the most interesting part of the plan. Trae Young is. When Washington acquired Trae, his market value was also surprisingly low. Despite being a 4-time All-Star and one of the league's most productive offensive guards, teams reportedly weren't exactly lining up to trade for him. And that wasn't because Trae suddenly forgot how to play basketball. When healthy, he can still put up elite scoring and playmaking numbers. The bigger issue was his contract, his defensive limitations, and the uncertainty surrounding his fit on a winning team. So what did Washington do? They bought low. Instead of giving up a massive package of first-round picks, the Wizards were able to make the move without sacrificing the kind of assets you would normally expect for a star player. And that's where this gets interesting. Washington doesn't necessarily need Trae Young to become the superstar who leads them to the playoffs. They need Trae to become valuable again. If Trae has a huge season, improves his efficiency, creates easy offense for Washington's young players, and proves he can lead a competitive offense, his trade value could change dramatically. Suddenly, teams that ignored him before could start calling. And if both Trae Young and Anthony Davis increase their value, Washington could potentially enter the next phase of the rebuild with an enormous collection of assets. That is why saying the Wizards' rebuild is over might be completely premature. The Wizards aren't necessarily building for next season. They could be building for 3, 4, or even 5 years from now. The real goal may be to collect talent, develop young players, maximize veterans, and wait until the perfect moment to make the massive move. And that's why Wizards fans should be patient. Because if Davis and Trae both perform at their best, Washington could have something far more valuable than a quick first-round playoff appearance. They could have the assets to build a real contender. The Wizards may not be finished rebuilding. They may have just entered the most important part of the rebuild yet. The Wizards' secret plan is starting to make sense. Trae Young wanted a max contract, and the Wizards actually gave it to him. On June 22, Washington agreed to a 4-year, $212 million deal with Trae. And at first glance, this looks completely insane. Why would a rebuilding team commit that much money to a small guard with defensive concerns in the middle of the NBA's second apron era? But what if the contract isn't really about winning right now? What if Trae Young is actually the perfect player for Washington's bigger plan? Because once you look at the NBA's new draft lottery system, this starts to look a lot less random. The league recently changed the lottery odds because tanking had become a serious problem. Previously, the 3 worst teams each had a 14% chance at the no. 1 pick. That gave teams an obvious incentive to lose as many games as possible. But the new system changed the balance. Now, the absolute worst teams actually have less incentive to tank, while teams finishing somewhere around the middle of the lottery can have surprisingly strong odds at moving up. And that could be exactly where Washington wants to live. Think about Trae Young's Atlanta years. Since becoming Atlanta's franchise star, the Hawks repeatedly finished around the middle of the standings rather than completely collapsing. 5th, 8th, 7th, 10th, 9th. That is basically the perfect range for a team that wants to stay competitive enough to avoid being the absolute worst team, while still having a legitimate chance at landing a high draft pick. Now add Anthony Davis to the equation. Davis is too talented for Washington to be terrible every night, but he also isn't enough by himself to turn this roster into a championship contender. Trae and AD together could create the ultimate mediocre team. Good enough to win games, not good enough to make serious noise in the playoffs. And that might actually be the plan. Because Washington doesn't need to win 50 games next season. They need to develop their young talent, increase the value of their veterans, and collect another premium draft pick. And once those young players are finally ready to compete, Trae's massive contract could become much less important depending on how Washington structures its future roster. There's another huge clue. Look at the rest of this roster. Washington added AJ Dybantsa, a highly touted young prospect, but he's still a rookie. They also brought in Adrian and Chris Middleton. Those moves don't exactly scream championship contender. They scream let's remain competitive while figuring out what we actually have. And that's why I think Wizards fans could be in for a rude awakening. They might expect Trae Young and Anthony Davis to immediately lead Washington into the playoffs, but the Eastern Conference is already loaded with teams that should be ahead of them. The Knicks, Celtics, 76ers, Pistons, Raptors, Pacers, Heat, Hawks and several others all have legitimate reasons to believe they can compete for the postseason. Washington could easily land somewhere around the play-in range. And ironically, that might be exactly what the front office wants. So when you look at the $212 million Trae Young contract, don't automatically assume Washington has abandoned the rebuild. The Wizards may have simply found a creative way to rebuild without completely bottoming out. They're trying to stay competitive, develop young players, maximize veteran trade value, and keep themselves in position for another high draft pick. It looks confusing right now. But if this plan works, Wizards fans might eventually realize the front office knew exactly what it was doing.